So good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Bogo, the editor-in-chief of Audubon magazine. If you're attending this talk, you're likely already familiar with Audubon, but for anyone who may be new to us, Audubon's the quarterly print magazine published by the National Audubon Society. And we also regularly publish stories about birds and bird conservation on audubon.org. So we're excited to invite you to the first of what we hope will be a series of conversations on the story behind a magazine story. And for this one, we'll be offering a behind the scenes look at our feature story on roseate spoonbills. This story was the cover of our winter 2022 issue, and it followed along with scientists who are striving to understand what's happening with roseate spoonbills and what that might say about their and all of our ability to adapt to climate change. Now, I'd love to introduce you to three people who played a pivotal role in developing the story. Hannah Waters, who is a senior editor at Audubon, specializing in climate coverage, conservation photographer Max Stone, and Jerry Lorenz, who is Audubon Florida's director of research. They all have unique perspectives on the process, and we hope this conversation will both delve into some of the story's insights and roseate spoonbills and provide a window into what the magazine process is actually like. So if you have questions as we talk, feel free to drop them into the chat, and Jess Lieber, who is also a senior editor at the magazine and joined us today, will help curate those so we can either raise them in real time or in a Q&A period near the end. So just hang tight if you drop in a question and we don't get to it right away. So first, I thought we'd start at the beginning. Hannah, as the writer, that's always a good place to start. When did you first become aware of this story, and when did you decide it was the right time to tell it?
Yeah, so for me, this story started in 2018. I actually got a tip from a coworker that there were neotropic cormorants nesting in Florida Bay. Welcome to bird journalism. So neotropic cormorants are like a more tropical species. So the fact that they were nesting in southern Florida was a notable event. So I reached out to Jerry, who is our Florida Bay expert at Audubon, to just get his take. And during that conversation, he introduced me to the spoonbill story and this, what he had observed over his career, that roseate spoonbills had been nesting in Florida Bay for so many decades. And, they had kind of up and left from his perspective. I was very interested in it, but the story didn't feel quite ready yet because they were still in Florida, and they also, there wasn't a super clear explanation for where they were going and why. So I kind of stuck it in a drawer to return to later. Then at the end of 2021, we were talking about doing a feature story on climate change range shifts. So one of the things we're expecting with climate change is as temperatures rise and all these environmental conditions change, that habitats are going to shift, and that's going to force wildlife, including birds, to move and to relocate. So that's what we call a range shift, when they're shifting from one area to another area. And so I immediately thought of the spoonbills and Jerry's story. So I called him back up to check in on how the spoonbills were doing. And in that time, a number of important things had changed, I found out. One is that during a few of the previous years, there were actually young spoonbills that it's called an eruption, that's with an I. And so they basically are exploring. They're like they're teenagers and they're flying all over. And they had been seen as far north as Maine and Minnesota and Quebec. So like for a Florida species, that's pretty unusual. Also in that time, they had started nesting in South Carolina. So they had completely left Florida and were experimenting nesting in completely new places. And that's really significant. It's more significant in some ways than the young birds exploring. If a bird is nesting in a new place, that means that's safe to them. There's habitat. They have food not only to feed themselves, but to feed their chicks. And these birds actually successfully raised chicks there. So that's it's a pretty big deal. And then also in that time, Jerry had done some more analysis and felt much more confident that this was a climate change shift, that basically sea levels were rising in South Florida and in Florida Bay, and had clearly been pushing these birds out so that this habitat was no longer suitable for them and they were going elsewhere. And then the last thing was that he had some really keen insights when we talked on the phone. Jerry was telling me about how, the birds are smart, the birds are leaving, they're seeing that things are changing, but people are moving currently to South Florida. People are not leaving. So there was a lot had changed. And also there was this kind of deeper philosophical idea at play. So I pitched it to our senior editors. And I went down in March 2022 to see it for myself.
You're on mute, Jenny.
Thank you, Jerry. You've been living this story for a long time. How did you feel about I guess maybe we can start with what fieldwork is like and what you were observing and sort of what you were hoping Hannah would see when she came to report it.
Well, just to, doing field work in this habitat, some people think going to the Florida Keys and being outside is just fun, but where we work, it's a lot of hard, physical, dangerous labor. The places where the birds nest are mangrove colonies out in Everglades National Park, and those islands are just basically mud. So let's start there, and Hannah experienced this firsthand, is you walk into some of these places and you'll be kind of sliding along in the mud, and then all of a sudden you'll sink up to your waist, and you're kind of stuck. And so you're fighting that, and then they're made, the trees, the forest itself is mangrove trees, which put off these prop roots that really, I swear they reach out and try to grab you when you're walking through. On top of that, now you got to get up, sometimes 20, 30 feet in the air to see into a nest. Some of the islands have rattlesnakes on them, so you got to be aware of that. And then there's the mosquitoes, right? Every one of these islands can have from bad mosquitoes to, oh my God, bad. And you got to contend with that while you're holding cameras and taking, we got a mirror on a pole that you got to stick up there to be able to see. You got to have your binoculars. So it is a real ordeal to be able to collect this kind of data. But then we also start doing things like taking chicks out of the nest and putting bands on them, trying to capture adults while they're foraging so we can put tracking devices on them. And that was very important. Going back to what Hannah said is when we first talked in 2018, I had just started formulating these ideas and putting some flesh to them. We had water level data that we could compare to trends in sea level. And so we could see what the water levels were and whether they were appropriate for the birds. But a couple linchpins, especially this one is the biggest, is in 2019, we started putting tracking devices. We've done that twice before this in the early 1990s and the mid 2000s. And we put these tracking devices on these birds starting in 2019 and started following them, and they weren't foraging where they historically did. They were flying further to get food from the nest. They were overwintering, summering in the bird's case, in northern Florida instead of in the Everglades. So it really that was a critical component. And then having the GIS background of one of my former employees to show that the water levels were what changed. It was half baked when Hannah came, and it was pretty much fully well done when we started to do this. So just a little background.
Yeah, and so Mac, when we assigned you to this story, what typically happens when we assign magazine stories is we figure out who's writing it. In this case, this was a story we developed, one of our editors had developed, and so Hannah went to report it, and then we assign this to a photographer who we feel would be a good fit for the story. You were a great fit for some really obvious reasons because your history with the spoonbills also goes farther back. So do you want to sort of provide some context for that?
Yeah, I'll piggyback a little bit off what Jerry said, and he didn't paint the job in a very favorable light. I think to certain people that job description sounds wonderful, and it sounded great to me in 2009. And so I actually worked with Jerry, and they have multiple types of research positions at the Everglades Science Center. So they have researchers who are studying prey base for the fish, which is what the spoonbills eat, and people who are studying the submerged aquatic vegetation, and they're also taking these salinity transects. And then, of course, there's the spoonbill program. So I was very lucky in that I got to do both. I got to do the prey-based fish monitoring, and I also was the spoonbill researcher in 2011 or 2012. So getting this assignment, I've traced all the steps that Emily Johnson is now doing, and for the Everglades Science Center. So I know the Bay, I know Everglades National Park very intimately, and I can attest it is how Jerry describes it. It's unlike the islands that are just mud, it's like a jungle gym in mud. So you're constantly like tripping over yourself to try and get to these nests to survey these birds. And bringing along cameras and technology makes it even trickier. But I was super grateful to get the assignment because I could already envision how I wanted to tell the story, how I wanted to, what kind of treatment I wanted to give it. And I knew it was going to be a tall order. But fortunately for me too, I get to go back, and I was just actually back there last week. Still helping Jerry out and the Spoonbill team deploy some cameras on nests. So I'm still very close to it, very intimate with it.
And to follow up on that, that is, it's, Mac was a natural choice, right? He did an exemplary job for us. And I worry when I take people into these places that nobody else is allowed to go. And when I do get reporters and photographers that, I take out, there is a bit of discomfort. It's one of those things that I don't want them doing anything that can harm the birds. And I'm not, if I don't know them, I'm never sure. I make it clear that if we get into a colony and I say it's time to go, we're gone. We're not waiting around for you to take more pictures, or we're out. The birds are in danger. And with Mac, it's like, I'll just send him out there to do it. I don't need this babysit. It's just, Mac, go take pictures. You're good. So that was a natural choice. And when Hannah and I first started discussing it, that came up. I was like, I would be really comfortable if you were to get Mac Stone involved here, and that would make me a lot more comfortable. So just wanted to throw that in.
I just had to pay Jerry half.
Fortunately, Mac was already one of our favorite photographers. So yeah, working with bird colonies then and sensitive species, there's a certain level of trust as sort of the scientist and a person who's really sort of trying to understand what the future holds for them, in inviting journalists and photographers out to observe your work. How did you, even I'm assuming an Audubon journalist, we're certainly familiar with birds, but it sounds like there's a little trust that needed to happen there also with Hannah going out in the field.
Hannah disabused me of that pretty quickly. I mean, we had our conversations, and it wasn't like she needed to be completely educated from the start, because we had talked over the years. And yes, again, I do worry about it, but since we had not met and she had not been in the field, but I went out with her. I think, Hannah, did I go out with you one day or 2 days? I don't remember.
We did one full day.
Okay. And, it's right away. It's like, okay, she gets it. And so I became very comfortable with that as well. And, I've said this multiple times, is how impressed I am with the story itself. Because Hannah did just an amazing job in putting things together that the quotes she got from my friends and colleagues. There's one that my colleague Eric Stabenow from Everglades National Park has at the end about Everglades restoration was just a moonshot and now it's impossible. That is just a fabulous quote. So complete professionalism, and I was comfortable really fast.
Yeah, so Hannah, there's a lot of choices you make as a writer about what goes into the story, right? And like what doesn't make the cut. We have a limited number of pages in the magazine to tell these really complicated, nuanced stories about bird life. how did you make those? What are some of the decisions you made?
It was such a big story. It's the biggest story I've ever written for sure. And there's so much going on, right? Like there's a story of the spoonbills. There's Jerry's story through his research. There's the story of Everglades restoration and frankly, the whole history of the Everglades development, and then on top of that, there's climate change colliding with all of this. So I had to make a lot of choices. I spent 4 full days in the field with Jerry's team. It's what we gather in what we call scene in the business. But that's like so many quotes, so many characters, so many locations I could have included. I spent 5 hours in Jerry's office interviewing him. I had all of these sources. I just had so much material. And what's interesting about this story is it's a story of absence. Of those 4 days in the field, most of the places I went did not have spoonbills. There was one day, the day I went out with Jerry, he took me to Turnkey and told me, while we were there, this place had hundreds and hundreds of spoonbill nests. And you would hear them taking off and it sounded like a helicopter from their wing beats, these amazing stuff. But when I didn't see that, me in the field, I went there and there was nothing there. And so how do I convey loss? So to do that, I actually had to start with a scene. Basically, I ended up going to 7 or 8 of these bird colonies while we were there. And only one of them was super active, and it's this one at Diamond Key. So interestingly, I had to start with the most active, bustling site to let the reader have the same experience that Jerry did, which is the reader meets a bustling colony and gets to meet the birds in a super productive colony with chicks, and then you lose them. That's the only place they are in the story. The rest of the story is the birds are not there. So it took me a long time to figure out where to start it. And yeah, I cut probably tens of thousands of words that I wrote throughout the course of my 3-month drafting period.
You had mentioned to us earlier that there's a very tight, impressive, maybe 2 paragraphs on the history of Everglades restoration, and in an earlier draft that had been like its own section of the story.
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, like I originally had, there used to be, poachers in the plume hunting days that went after all these wading birds and would go in the middle of the night and wipe out a colony and sell the feathers. And, Bob Allen, who founded the Everglades Science Center, said he saw spoonbill wings being sold as fans. So I wrote that whole thing. No, doesn't fit into the story at all. There's all kinds of stuff like that where I just, I feel like I could write a book on it if I wanted. There's so much there.
There have been a lot of books written about it, Hannah, and there's room for more. The education, the system is just that complex, and the history of it is just really strange. It's not one of battles and groups of people, and it's just these individual and tycoon type people that have come in and changed the entire state, early in the state's history. So, and that led to what the Everglades is now. So there's this whole history of the state and the ecology of the system that is, and how you got that in 2 paragraphs and hit the ball that well is just pretty amazing.
Yeah, amazing.
Thank you.
So we had a request to show photos. I'm going to attempt to share my screen with the cover, and I thought, Mac, maybe you could take this moment to talk about how your perspective as a field biologist helped sort of shape how you took photos for this story, and then maybe also describe a little bit this particular cover shot.
Sure. So for those of you, if you haven't read the article yet, or just to give a very brief synopsis of what the field work is like, Emily Johnson now and her intern Sam Goss, they go out every day into the 850 square mile estuary that is Florida Bay, leaving from the office in Tavernier. So they boat out and they basically go on a treasure hunt for spoonbills. And so they're leaving at first light, and they're typically coming back late in the afternoon. going onto these islands where no one else is allowed to go because of sensitive nesting habitat. And once they find a nest, they'll then mark it, and then they'll come back around every 7 to 10 days, monitoring those birds up until they're 21 days old, at which point they can be deemed as successful. And if they're not successful, if the nest fails, for example, then they can write it down and say, okay, this nest failed due to this and this cause. Recently, we've been deploying these cameras, trail cameras on nests. So we've had some good insight into some of the reasons some of these birds are failing, in addition to just weather changes or rain events. So my experience in actually having this job like really allowed me to be able to kind of forecast what the day was going to be like, what every day was going to be like, would allow me to feel comfortable not always just following Emily, which which we were actually joking about last week. I was like, Emily is small and it's very limber. She's like a little spider monkey going through the mangroves. And like I'm wearing a big like 30-pound backpack full of camera gear, and I'm just like, look, I'm not taking the Emily route. I'm taking my route, and so I'll forge my own path. But only because I've had this job and I've done this before did I feel comfortable, knowing that it was okay to get out in front of her and anticipate some of her movements, what she was doing, and to be able to react quickly when she would come up on things. So I felt comfortable, for example, climbing this mangrove and shooting down this empty nest of this colony that had been abandoned. Felt comfortable knowing, picking up the little nuances of how she does the job, which is very different. She'll go and actually touch the eggs to see if they're warm or they're cold on a nest that she's uncertain if it had failed or succeeded. And then, of course, covering this aerial is always important. So I got to charter a helicopter to be able to shoot some of the aerials and give context. But what's really wild, actually, is the little twists and turns that happened during this assignment. And if you go back a slide, that little photo there up at the top, the thumbnail size photo of the two adults on the nest, I deployed a DSLR camera, two DSLR cameras on one of the nesting colonies to be able to get higher res images than what the cameras were doing. To get more detail, see if we could learn more about the birds. And sure enough, the camera takes, I can't remember, I think it's something like 4,000 photos. And I get it back and going through all the images and slowly cycling through and zoomed in on one of them, and it turned out that the bird was banded. And so I sent it to Jerry, and Jerry had an active banding program. Jerry, how many years did you have that active banding program?
Well, it's still ongoing, but we're only doing 15 to 20 chicks a year from 2004 to 2008. We banded almost 3,000 chicks between Florida Bay and Tampa Bay. So, and we're still only at like 3,100. So that was the really intensive period.
Yeah, that's a lot of birds. And if you're ever out in the Everglades, like we often do, if we're ever, monitoring these birds, you can typically see that they have a band on, but you can never read it if they're the old bands, because they're always, they're worn by the Everglades. So they're just completely washed away. But putting this, DSLR 5D Mark III on a nest allowed us to really zoom in, and on that leg of that adult, we were able to make out the actual letters of that band. And when I sent it to Jerry, he looked it back through his records, confirmed it with me, did a non-biased confirmation with his other biologists in the office, and it turned out to be the oldest known spoonbill on record ever recorded in the wild. So it's just like, completely just a complete surprise, and also just like one of the wonderful examples how art and science can influence each other in a way.
And
I was
that's
actually
a
just
question
Yeah,
we had
sorry.
was how old that spoonbill, or how old spoonbills are, is actually a question we had. So
Well,
how
if
old
you
are
were to look it
spoonbills?
up right now, if you were to actually Google this, which I did before this webinar, because I was just curious if it had been updated, and it says that it's 15 years is the oldest known spoonbill in the wild, but that's not true, is it, Jerry?
Nope. No, that
What do we?
was a bird we captured last time we were putting satellite trackers on them that my predecessor banded. And so when we captured that bird, it was just serendipity too. We were putting out traps on spoonbill nests, and my crew, it was the last satellite transmitter, we were putting it out, and they captured a bird that the guy who hired me put on 15 years before. And so then that's when we were starting to put these bands on. And so Mac stumbles across essentially the same thing, bands that we put out back then, and it's 18 and a half years old. So and we recently, again, Mac and I went over some footage of our trail cams, and we found those bands that we put out, the ones that Mac referred to as faded. They started fading within 3 years or 4 years. So at the end of the 4th year, we quit using them and switched to band types. So now every single one of those metal bands, at least we know those birds are 15 years old, right? 15, 16 years old. So I found another one that was just like 17 years, 8 months too. But it is fascinating that Matt came back, and I was staggered by that bird having lived that long. And probably spoonbills, because of their size and because they're basically the mean reproductive maturity. They're kind of like humans. The reproductive maturity has a lot of variability in it, but 3.5 years. So, that and their size tells us that they probably lived to about 25 to 30 years old. And there was actually one that lived in a zoo to, I believe, 41 years old. So
someone actually asked, which is such a good question. They noted that spoonbill captures the imaginations of so many, they attract so many birders. They're this beloved species. Why is it, do you all think that spoonbills hold this sort of special, have this special relationship with people, or capture their imagination in such a compelling way?
I mean,
they're so funky looking. Everything about them is so funky looking in their face. When you really look at the cover shot, it really, really describes their personality. They're just quirky. They're just odd looking. They're old world looking, just yeah.
Well, there's the colors, obviously, and I always caution Mac to quit making fun of my birds. I think they're handsome. So.
They're amazing. It was hilarious. So I was out in the field with these two biologists, Emily Johnson and Casey King, and they spend all their days with spoonbills, right? But every time we saw one, we'd be see a flock of egrets fly by, and it'd be mostly white birds, and there'd be 1 or 2 spoonbills in there. And every time Casey would be like, "Oh, my spoonbill. Oh, my spoonie." And I'd be like, "You see these birds every day." But I was like, "Do you ever get tired of that?" And she said she never gets tired of it. They're just so pink. What's not to love?
Well, I saw them yesterday, and they'll still stop me in my shoes. I was out in the colonies, and we must have sat there just observing some birds in a tree for probably 10 or 15 minutes, just watching. And they're astounding, and they are, just the noises they make. And Jenny, I can't answer that question. I just look at why not? It's one of those things that's just so cool.
Hannah, part of the story I really love is these moments of description where you're out in the field with the biologists and you're describing how they're sort of contorting themselves in all sorts of ways in order to do this research. Can you talk a little bit, maybe describe a little, as someone new to this type of field research, what that was like for you as a reporter and what you observed out there?
Yeah, well, this isn't, I was a field biologist in a former life, so I've done my fair share of field work. For another story with Audubon, I camped in Alaska for 5 days, so pretty hardy. But this was the hardest, most grueling week of my life. I'd be at the field station at 7 a.m. loading vans with equipment. We drive it to the dock, then unload everything, load it into a boat, be on the water by 8 a.m. And then we'd just be out there hiking. We would stake the boats offshore, and we'd kayak, it's like sea kayak into islands. The most really, really hard work. Every day I came up exhausted. I was chugging those electrolyte, like the medical grade electrolyte juices,
Pedialyte.
just to like restore, restore myself at the end of every day. But it's also one of the most beautiful weeks of my life. I mean, it is unreal out there. Every single day was different. Every place we went was different. Like each of those mangrove islands with its own complete universe. Alien-like landscapes in some cases. There was one that I kayaked through these milky teal waters, and there's all just like individual little mangrove shoots shooting up and spoonbills circling overhead. And then we get in the boat and go to the next island, and it's like all these super, super tall mangrove trees. And in the middle, there's a pond that's like covered in algae, and there's black-necked stilts foraging there. And there's spoonbills standing on the treetops. And it's just like a grand tour of the most beautiful places. So, it's a lot of work and it's super hard. And I'm so impressed with all of you. I think every single of the field biologists I met there, I was just like, I can't believe this is your job. Like, I can't believe you do this every single day. I'm barely surviving. But yeah, you definitely benefit from it if you like to be out there in that kind of beauty.
Hannah, I was looking at those same blackneck stilts yesterday, but the islands do it themselves. We talked about, how appealing the spoonbills are. Well, Florida Bay is pretty daggone appealing too. The interconnectedness of the islands with the bay through these mud banks, and just the way the water can change color and change looks from one basin to the other. In the islands, is Mac and I were discussing this in the lead up here, is the personality of the islands. There are ones that they clearly hate you, and there are other ones that they're like, oh, welcome back, my friend, kind of thing. So it really was different. But I want to go back just one second to what I was saying in the previous question is, spoonbills are fascinating and I love them, but that's not why I study them. That's not why we study them. We study them because they're ecological indicators. We would be studying another bird if they were the ones giving us this important information, if they were the ones that were, we're able to given our background, we're able over time to realize what they were doing a few years ago and then why they were doing it. And so they help us understand Everglades restoration and now sea level rise and climate change. So it's not the beautiful pink bird that attracted me to them in the first place. It was the information we can gain from them.
Well, didn't you show up as a fish biologist, Jerry? You didn't even show up to study birds.
My background was in fish, and that's what my PhD is marine biology and fisheries. But I swore that I was going to change the culture here at Audubon one fish at a time, and that we were talking about fish, not birds. And damn if y'all just didn't suck me in.
So this dovetails nicely into a question about to what extent a story idea is driven by a specific Audubon sort of conservation priority. And that's certainly something, we think about at the magazine when we're developing story ideas. But Hannah, could you specifically sort of talk about how you vetted this story and sort of what consideration that might have played in this?
Yeah, so, we're Audubon magazine at the National Audubon Society, but we don't, we're not communications. We're not just covering Audubon work. But of course, we cover ornithology, we cover birds, and we cover the environmental and conservation movement. But of course, Audubon staff are an important part of the birding ornithology. If we didn't include that work, we'd have a huge gap. So when Jerry, originally told me the story of the spoonbills, I really had to do my due diligence to make sure, just because he's my coworker doesn't mean I believe everything he says, right? So I spent a lot of...
Nor should you.
No way.
And that's journalism, right? You stitch together many perspectives. to try to tell a holistic story. So, even before I went down there, I, was looking into Jerry's background. Is there anyone else in the Everglades studying spoonbills? Who are the other spoonbill experts? And when I looked around, it's Jerry. I mean, he wrote the spoonbill entry on Birds of the World, which is this massive bird encyclopedia. He's really the expert down there. Whenever I talk to anyone to ask questions about spoonbills, they always, kicked me over to Jerry. And then my role after I reported the story was to really make sure that the spoonbills and Jerry's work was situated in this larger landscape of the Everglades. So I talked to Mark Cook at the South Florida Water Management District. I talked to Eric Stapano at the Everglades National Park and all kinds of other folks to fully tell this story. Yeah.
Did an excellent job too, then.
Thank you, Jerry.
I'm going to start folding in some additional questions. Someone has noted they're in the Dominican Republic and have had informal reports of spoonbills nesting in different parts of the country and are interested. There's a couple sort of photography related questions too. They're interested in setting up camera traps to try to monitor for them. So they're wondering if there are any key indicators that they and their team could look to sort of help advance that work.
Ooh, I would have to think about that for a while. I have never been to the Dominican, so I don't know, but it's definitely a bird that prefers to nest on islands of some kind. It does that, but I would defer to Mac about how to use camera traps, and I have. I mean, that's how I'm using these camera traps, is I get Mac's input. So I don't know,
Max, someone also asked about drone photography and what role that might have played. And I think there's some interesting questions around drone photography and birds that maybe you could also speak to.
Well, yeah, sure. Just on the question about the DR, I think it would just totally depend on, multiple things: where the birds are nesting, under whose study permit is it, and like whether there's a process, what questions are you trying to answer? For our study, at least this is the way it started, right, Jerry, is the very binary question of, do they succeed or do they fail? And now we're starting to get a lot more questions we want answered after reviewing some of the footage. As to drones, so within Everglades National Park, there are no drones allowed. So we don't use drones at all for any of our photographic or video work. In terms of using them with other bird species, I think it really depends. I think no matter what, you have to, as a photographer, you have to work with professionals, biologists who intimately know the birds and the subjects, because not all birds are the same. And not all birds, even individuals, are the same. There are some colonies. I remember when I was working with Jerry, 12 years ago, there was one or two birds that allowed you to kind of walk right up to the nest, and they would never leave. And then the rest of the birds would always get up and leave. So, it really depends, but you should always, if you're going to be working with birds, and especially nesting birds, you should be working with a professional, with a biologist.
Yeah, absolutely.
To pull it back.
And the other thing is spoonbills. The reason that the rest of the wading birds in the Everglades get censused annually as well, but that's done from helicopters and planes because they nest in the treetops. So you can really just go fly over and just count them. Spoonbills nest very low in the canopy, and you can't see them from the air, and so that would be a questionable use of drones. Though if we were allowed to use them, and it seems like the Park Service is starting to go that route to allow research drones, it would make our job so much easier, because at least we could we may not be able to get a count or anything else, but at least we know there were birds on the island before we went crawling around in there for several hours. And it would make our life easier. So as far as surveying them goes, drones may help, but they're not going to allow you to get accurate information.
and they're a little less colorful from a storytelling perspective as
Yes.
the reporter out there in the field crawling around. Someone, to pull it back a little to the story process, someone asked about the editing process. And I can say, you know, as someone who was involved in editing this story, Hannah, you had like a 5,000 word draft that you had sent to me and then said, wait, I'll make it shorter. And you self-edited and pulled out like 1,000 words. So it goes through the reporter and then an editor, and then there's another layer of top editing, someone who reads it and polishes it. And then the gold standard really of journalism is also fact checking. So we put stories through a fact checking process. And Jerry, you experienced that fact checking process from the other end of the phone. So is there anything else is there anything you'd like to say about
Well,
that
it
process?
I was impressed. I mean, it was every little thing that they wanted to make sure of. I mean, it was stuff that there are a couple questions I probably rolled my eyes at because the answer was obviously yes or no or whatever. But it was really just fascinating to talk to Susan when she called. She started, we were both driving and we talked for, I think, well over an hour. No, she was not. I was driving. I was driving back from Tampa. And she said, I'm not going to get through this. I have to go pick up my kids from school. And when she got back from that, she called me back and I was still driving. And we talked for another hour. I mean, it was literally every detail needed to be fact checked. And, you know, I have had my facts checked before for stories, but never that comprehensively. And a lot of the questions I couldn't answer, right? Because Hannah would write something and I didn't know it. You know, she got it from Mark Cook, or she got it from Eric, or she got it from whoever. And I'd be like, I don't know. You know, ask Hannah where she got that information. So
that was sort of a clue to the, you know, who else Hannah had talked to in the process of reporting this story.
So yeah, it was very impressive.
Yeah, I think everyone listening here needs to like really understand what that means. It means that when you get the article, it is the distillation of so many hands and so many eyes on a product. And at least, you know, from a reader, that's wonderful to know because you know what you're reading has been thoroughly vetted. But then also as an artist, as a photographer who's, you know, works within this process, it's really, really great because you know that all the images that, or at least from the photography standpoint, all the images that you submit, which can be tens of thousands for a story, you know that they are carefully selected for their storytelling qualities. And there are very, very few magazines that do that. And so it's a really, really wonderful process to work with. And I got to give a really big shout of gratitude to Sabine Meyer, who's a director of photography, because that was, I mean, working with her was wonderful, and she has such a great eye. So she picked a lot of images that were big surprises for me.
So you took a lot of photographs, you sent in your selects to Audubon's photo team, and then once the story is fact checked and through editing, it's fit into a layout and it's trimmed and captioned to make sure it all sort of fits neatly in those 8 pages or however many pages it might assume. And then Mac, you aren't really involved in the photo selection at that point, right? Like that happens in another part of the process.
That's right. It's like this little Christmas gift that you get, which is great. Well, it's also like pretty terrifying because at least for this assignment, you know, Sabine told me that this was going to be a cover story, which is enough pressure just on its own. And so I felt a tremendous weight to not only do the story right by Jerry and by Hannah, who have been putting so much into it, and by Emily, who's doing the work, but also, you know, you want to make sure you get that call again. so you know, kind of visualizing what I wanted to shoot for the cover. It's actually why I have this big old Canon of a lens here, because I knew I was going to have to bring this thing in on a kayak in the salt water and then like lug it through a jungle of mangroves. While Emily was surveying nests, I would just sit there and kind of peek through the mangroves and just fire off, a couple thousand frames, which y'all so beautifully put together in that little GIF that shows the different looks of the spoonbill, which eventually became the cover. But yeah, I was very surprised at the cover, and I was surprised by some of the images that were chosen in the spreads. But they're all wonderful because they all help tell the story.
Yeah,
And
I think that was that this picture selection was just perfect. It really, I know Mac's skills, and I'm sure there are 100 other pictures, and the web version actually does have some of the extra pictures, but the print version was just, I mean, it was just spectacular.
yeah, if you scroll up to the link to the digital version of the story in the chat, you can see that the GIF that Mac is referring to that kind of ticks through different spoonbill gazes at the camera and is really kind of magical. So you saw it, so then you got the story and you saw it for the first time. Jerry, the magazine landed in your mailbox and you saw it for the first time. What was how did you feel about that?
Well, initially I was anxious and excited about it, right? You don't know what you're going to get. But I immediately was rather humbled and I guess a little bit ashamed that I came off looking much better than I actually am. But as I started reading it from not such an egocentric point of view, it became, yeah, this is really important information. And Hannah and Mac have done a tremendous job on getting the points across, both with their words and their pictures. It's a story that I mean, it resonates because it is ongoing. It is, we have all this data from 30 years ago. Now it's all changed and it tells a completely different story. And so the Hannah captured that beautifully. And so then it became, yeah, this is important information, and it's very well done. And so from the time it hit the mailbox to the time I actually came around to being able to read it with some objectivity took a little time.
And Hannah, since you're the one that so admirably distilled this in the story, could you, for anyone who hasn't fully read the story online yet, could you provide a picture of ultimately how the spoonbills are doing and sort of what this research has revealed about spoonbills?
Sure, Jerry, you can correct me after, but no, I mean, it's a really interesting story because, the spoonbills used to, well, when Jerry started the research there, all spoonbills in Florida were basically all nesting in Florida Bay, which is basically the Everglades National Park is partially land and partially ocean, and the bay is the ocean part of it. They basically have shifted north and are now nesting in the inland Everglades and the explanation is that sea levels are rising down there. They're rising faster in South Florida than anywhere in the world, than the global average. Correct myself. And as a result, the places where spoonbills used to hunt for prey to feed their chicks, those places are too deep and too salty. Spoonbills are, for wading birds, they're pretty stocky. They're more like a chicken. They don't have like super long legs, like a heron. So they really can't stand in very deep water. Jerry's done the calculation. They need 13 centimeters deep water is the ideal height of the water for them to hunt. So that's not very deep. So even the little bit of sea level rise, that's a little bit from our perspective, but for them, it's a very big shift in the water depth. And so as a result, they're now nesting in the Everglades. I think, climate change is obviously transforming places, right? And there's putting a lot of struggles in wildlife's path and in our path, in society's path. But what I like about the story is spoonbills aren't it's not like they're gone. They're not in Florida Bay now and they're extinct. They are now just nesting somewhere else. As I wrote in the story, they're doing better in Florida than they have in decades. They're just no longer living where Jerry works anymore. So it's a story of a kind of personal loss and a grief and a transformation of place, but not necessarily the extinction of a species. And they're also now nesting not only in the Everglades National Park, but also in places like Georgia and South Carolina. So it's possible they'll do well there, but we really don't know. That's what's kind of scary about climate change. It's this massive experiment that we're doing on the planet that we can't take back really once it's begun. And we have to wait and see what it does and do our best to adjust and do everything we can to slow its rate.
I grew up in northern Kentucky, and I come from a big family there, and so does my wife. And I like to think that when I retire in the next few years, the spoonbills will have moved far enough north that I can go there and study them there. So that it's just how quickly they're moving.
They're in Tennessee now too, so they're almost there.
Yep, right.
Probably be a little easier.
No, it'd be too cold. It's too cold during the winter.
So one of my other favorite anecdotes from reporting the story touches on, I think, Jerry, something you had to say about being startled to see your role in this story painted in such a flattering light. Hannah, would you like to describe how you got all of the quotes that were in your story?
Yeah, it's a pretty standard thing I do when I'm especially reporting like a profile that's centered around a single person is, talk to people and be like, what do you think of this person? Like, what do you think of their work? So, Mark and Eric were super flattered. And then I think my treat for this piece was the Carl Hyacin quote. It's a very funny story. After I spent the week in the Everglades, I went to Miami for a few days to spend some time on the beach. And I had gone to a souvenir shop to pick up a beach read. And, Carl Hyacin writes all of these great crime romps in Florida. And he has one based in the Everglades called Skinny Dip. So it seemed perfect. So I picked it up. And when I sat down on the beach with my coffee to read it, I open up. And the first page is the little acknowledgement section. He thanks, his family members. And then it says, and to Dr. Jerry Lorenz, one of the many unsung heroes of the Everglades. And I could not believe that Jerry had followed me to Miami. So I had to email Carl and see what he had to say. You all work together, Jerry?
That was delightful. I did not expect that you would even know about that, or for that matter, that Carl would have anything nice to say about me. Yeah, that was a real treat seeing that.
You advised him on that book? Is that what had happened?
Yeah. He asked. They're just a small part of it. He and I, we got to know each other. He actually lived across the street from me for a couple of years, and we got to know each other pretty well. And he knew what I was doing. I had taken him out to the spoonbill colonies on several occasions. And when he was writing one of the characters up, he wanted some background that I could provide. And so I gave him a little bit of information, which he took with and ran and made this wonderful character. But he appreciated it. And I was just surprised that, Carl and I maybe talk once or twice a year now. And that Hannah was able to track him down and get a quote from him, I thought was pretty crazy.
So there's been a lot of, we're coming up on time now, and there's been a lot of interest in chat on what people might be able to do to support this work or research, or if you have any other recommended books for further reading. And so I thought maybe I'd ask if anyone has thoughts on that.
Well, I can always, I don't mean to step out of line if I am, but we are well, to put it bluntly, a fairly poor operation. And we are as the cost of living continues to go up, we are looking for any kind of donations that we can get. We are going to have to reduce some of our effort later this year because we can't afford the staff. And so there's always that. Hannah in the story, she says we went from working at 5 locations to working at 12, and now we're going back down to 9. So anybody got any ideas of where I can find enough support to keep those going would be nice. As far as books go, Bob Allen's books are really remarkable. He founded this office based on spoonbill research. While he produced 3 monographs on the birds he was working with, including definitive books on spoonbills, one on flamingos and one on whooping cranes. There's a history written by I'm drawing a blank. But it's called The Man Who Saved the Whooping Crane, and it tells Bob's history, which was fascinating. So those are some things that I would recommend. Bob also wrote a couple of popular books that talks about his work with spoonbills in Florida Bay. So as far as Everglades stuff goes, Michael Grunwald's The Swamp is really a fine read. That's a good place. It is comprehensive, and it's a good place to start understanding the complexities of both the politics and the demise and recovery of the Everglades. So that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, Michael Grunwald, recently I saw him tweet that when he came out with that book, that he wishes he had even thought about climate change or considered it when writing it. But I guess it came out in 2006 or something. So
yeah, he went out with me on the Bay, I think twice, 2 or 3 times, while he was working on that book, and I was amazed at some of the things he had found out that I thought were true, that he had found that were absolutely bogus. And so he really did his homework and worked really hard on that. If he wants to come back and do an update, I'll be happy to talk to him about sea level rise.
And of course, great, if you're interested in Audubon magazine and you don't yet receive it, we, as you've seen from this conversation, put an awful lot of effort into finding these important stories about birds and bird conservation, what it means for wildlife, what it means for us, and putting them in a magazine, giving you, sort of distilling all that context down to a tidy quarterly read. So the way to get Audubon magazine is to become a member of the National Audubon Society. And we also publish our content on audubon.org. So I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that that's how you can get Audubon magazine and read more of these stories in the future. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been an awesome look at sort of the process and the story behind this particular story. And as I mentioned, we'd love to do more of them in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone. And thanks for joining.
Mac and Hannah. Really appreciate what you did. See you guys.
Thank you, Jerry.